Welcome to this Getting Started with ORCID webinar series. In this session, we're going to cover next steps and maintenance of your ORCID adoption and ORCID membership. So we're going to talk about assessment of adoption and how you can go about doing that using your ORCID member report, integration reports, and affiliation report. We'll also talk about the importance of considering other persistent identifiers or PIDs in addition to ORCID. We'll talk about how ORCID adoption is really an iterative, ongoing process, and there's always a next step, no matter how far along you are. And then finally, we will talk about the importance of periodically checking in on your ORCID adoption and ORCID membership. So as you're getting started with ORCID, you'll want to do some assessment to measure your progress and do some benchmarking on your ORCID adoption amongst your researchers and just check in and see how things are going, because that can really help to inform how effective your efforts are and next steps that you can take. So the ORCID US community members have access to an ORCID member portal, which provides metrics on local ORCID adoption. And these can be found in 3 different reports. You've got your member report, 1 or more integration reports, depending on how many ORCID API integrations you have, and then an affiliation report. And when you log in to your member portal at member-portal.orcid.org, and you go to the tools dropdown that you're seeing highlighted here, this is where you can find all 3 of these reports. So first, we've got the ORCID member report, and this provides an overview of ORCID adoption in general across all integrations at your organization. So the example that we're seeing here is from the Research Triangle Institute, or RTI International, and this is just a screenshot of the top of the member report where you can see this organization has 3 integrations, and we can kind of get a snapshot of what's going on across all of those. And if we scroll down, some of the other types of metrics that you can find on your member report are things like new ORCID users at your organization per year, depending on their connections with your API integrations. Things like the number of ORCID IDs that have your organization's email domain associated with them, and also things like geographic location, where your users are coming from. And ORCID has a member reporting guide that you can find online as well that walks you through all of the different metrics that you can find on this report. If you have 1 or more ORCID API integrations, you can also look at each integration separately and get stats for them separately on your integration reports. So these reports show information about the ORCID IDs and activity that's taking place within a single ORCID API integration. Similar to the member report, you can see things like the number of unique ORCID IDs connected to your integration each year. And if your integration is writing data to ORCID records, which is recommended, the report will also show numbers on for example, if your integration is adding employment information, how many affiliations have been added, or if your integration is writing works information to ORCID records, how many ORCID records have been updated, the total number of works, and the types of works, for example. And then we also have the ORCID affiliation report, which shows information about individuals and their ORCID IDs if they have your organization listed publicly as an affiliation on their ORCID record. And affiliations include employment, education, qualifications, invited positions, distinctions, membership, and service. So anyone who has your organization, and specifically your organization's identifier listed on their ORCID record for any of these affiliations will show up in this report, whether they're currently at your institution or have been affiliated in the past. I do want to point out in the screenshot here, again, we're looking at RTI International, and you can see this list of registered organization IDs for RTI International. And here we have GRID, ROAR, and Ringgold. These are all persistent identifiers, or PIDs, for organizations. So ORCID is a PID for individuals. GRID, ROAR, and Ringgold are PIDs for organizations. The difference between these, GRID is no longer operating, but is an identifier that was used with ORCID in the past. So some people's ORCID records still have GRID IDs on them. GRID has actually transitioned to ROAR, which stands for Research Organization Registry, and it is an open, community-driven identifier for research organizations. Ringgold ID is a proprietary identifier that is no longer supported in ORCID, but again, it was supported in the past, so some ORCID records do still have Ringgold IDs for organizations. Now, speaking of these organizational identifiers, it's also important to think about other PIDs in addition to ORCID. ORCID really provides the most value when it's used along with other PIDs for other types of entities. So we already talked about ROAR for organizations. There's also DOIs, or digital object identifiers, that can be assigned to works, publications, data sets, other outputs, as well as grants now too. So thinking about ROAR, DOIs, there's also a new PID called RAID, which stands for Research Activity Identifier. And this is an identifier specifically for research projects. So that's another one to keep an eye on and potentially learn more about if that's relevant to your organization. There are also discipline-specific PIDs. So there are Research Resource IDs, or RRIDs, for biological resources, and ISGNs for physical samples. So depending on what kind of organization you're at and the kind of workflows that you are involved in, it's important to learn more about the other types of PIDs that are relevant to your work and try to include those and use those as well as ORCID. So it's a bigger picture and it's a larger ecosystem than just ORCID itself. ORCID adoption is definitely an iterative process. There's always a next step that can be taken no matter how far along you are in the adoption process. So there's always potential to expand your network of internal stakeholders. You know, there may be multiple different units or departments at your organization, and you might be partnering with one or two at first, but there's always room for expansion there and reaching out to other stakeholders that might be interested in ORCID as well. Consider additional API integrations. So if you already have some API integration, one or more, you can keep thinking about other workflows and other software systems that might benefit from integrating with ORCID. Things like adding more functionality to existing integrations. For example, if you're not already writing data to ORCID records, that's a next step you can think about. Same thing with reading data from ORCID records to streamline any data collection workflows that you might have. And if you're using vendor systems, it's always a good idea to reach out to your vendor to ask them to support ORCID if they're not already, or if they already have ORCID integrated, it's likely they can expand that ORCID functionality in their products. And then, of course, research, outreach to researchers is always ongoing. It's never too early or too late to make sure researchers know what ORCID is, get their ORCID IDs, and make sure they have their ORCID records populated with information. So that is always a next step. And just know that ORCID adoption is an ongoing journey. Some organizations are further along on this journey than others, but we're all on the same path, taking next steps forward and moving in the right direction. And then finally, it's important to periodically check in on your ORCID efforts and your ORCID membership by making sure your ORCID contacts are up to date year to year. If you get new staff at your organization, try to orient them to your organizational ORCID activities. Make sure you're signed up for our discussion forum and our listserv and are paying attention to our emails in case there are any updates or events we have going on so that you're staying in the loop. Make sure you join our community calls and other events if you have time. There's always more to learn. Of course, we have lots of resources on our ORCID US community website, so please do explore those. And of course, your ORCID US community staff always would love to hear from you, answer any questions that you have. We can correspond via email, we can schedule a Zoom call with you, but we would love to hear from you and consult with you. We are here to support everything that you're doing related to ORCID. So don't hesitate to reach out. The best way to get in touch with us is to send an email to orcidus@lyrasis.org. Thank you so much, and we hope to hear from you soon.